Okay, I believe we're ready to go. Good morning, everybody, and welcome to this webinar organized by Carbon Market Watch and the Emissions Trading Extra project. We're really glad to have you here joining this session to look at how to make the European emissions trading system an effective climate tool. Maybe just a few words on the background of this project. This is a multi-year project. We are organizing regular carbon pricing hubs under this project. This event is the fourth one in a series of webinars. The project is supported by the European Commission, the LIFE funding, as well as the European Climate Foundation. I'm just saying that to be transparent about this. I'm also saying this out of gratitude for their support, but of course, the usual disclaimer applies that anything which is said today does not necessarily represent the views of these funders. We're organizing this together, this project with 10 NGO partners. Specifically, thanks here and gratitude to our NGO colleagues at WISE in the Netherlands who have helped organizing this. One more housekeeping point, this session is recorded. We will make the recording and also the presentations of the speakers available after the session to all participants, but it will also be available online on the project website, which is etextra.org. I'm sure one of the colleagues can share a link for all participants to look at that website. So let's move on to our agenda. We can show it on the screen if all goes well. This is where we are today, this morning. We'll have a two-part webinar, looking first at the ETS agreement, what is in there, how it was reviewed recently, and then secondly, after the break, we'll look ahead into the future. What happens after 2030, and what can we think about that? What can we learn from the past experience? So we have two presentations, two exciting panel discussions in store. And without further ado, we can start with the first presentation. This will be Julien Pestiaux from Climact. He's a partner at Climact. And Julien, while I'm introducing you, you can already start sharing your screen. So we have your slides in front of us in a moment. Specifically, Climact is a consultancy providing expertise, as they say it themselves, to empower governments and organizations to act on climate change towards a sustainable zero carbon society by 2050. But specifically, the work presented here is a detailed and I would say first of its kind open source model to simulate the functioning of the European emissions trading system, specifically the coverage of the power sector and manufacturing industries. We already had a look at this, for those who remember, a year and a half when we organized the first carbon pricing hub, and it helped us to answer the question, is the Fit for 55 proposal to review the ETS, is it really fit for 55%? And well, the answer was not yet, unfortunately. But Climact kept updating their model throughout the ETS review process during the ongoing negotiations, and it was widely shared among EU lawmakers, among stakeholders, to provide that detailed assessment, to look at how different proposals would improve or worsen the functioning of the European carbon market. So this is now the latest available new update which will be presented of the model, and we really look forward to engage with the details and look at the numbers there. So Julien, I don't know if you're able to share your screen, and you can. I'll give the floor to you. Over to you. Thanks a lot. You are still muted.
Thank you, Sam. Can you see my screen?
Yes, apparently it works. I don't see it yet, but I have a thumbs up here.
Okay, great. So thanks for the introduction. We're happy to share the results of the model. It's really focused on. I'm trying to share my. So I'll give you a short project description as well, and then we'll dive into the results with the changes in the supply structure, the impact on the auctioning volumes, the free allocations, and the sum of the two. And just as a background, The aim is really to assess the impact of their various proposals. And now the update is about including the final ETS deal scenario. What do we have as key outputs? We look at auctioning volumes, free allocations, and all of the supply-demand balance and the surplus evolutions. So we're not looking at the impact on prices. The focus is really on the supply-demand balance. So we've assessed, as mentioned, 4 scenarios. The first 3 were the proposals that were turned into a report last year in August, and now we've looked at the final ETS deal. Just to give a clear overview of the differences here, you see how this final ETS deal will become the reference scenario here in our slides. It has a linear reduction factor of 4.3 until 27, and that increases to 4.4. The maritime sector is adding non-CO2 emissions, and with a phasing starting in 24, completed by 26. The social climate fund is starting in 26. The free allowances with a benchmark lower threshold of 0.3. There's no extension of CBAM, and the phase out, as you will see later, is intermediate between the Council, Commission and Parliament proposals. And there's a gradual phase out of the free allowances for the aviation sector with 25, 50, and 100% by 2026. And you see how the proposals were differing on some of those assumptions. Particularly, an important assumption is, of course, the more stringent reduction factor for the Parliament proposal, which you will see obviously had impact on various elements. The model now allows the user to test those 4 predefined scenarios or other ones as well. But if you want to use the model, we'll share it on our website, on our Climact website, and you'll be able to look at the various proposals and the final deal. In the model, there's yes.
Yeah, sorry. I just noticed, and there's a question in the chat as well. If it's possible to put the slides in full screen mode. Apparently, they're still in presenter mode.
Is that better?
Yes, yes, that's better. Thanks a lot.
So now you should see my screen even better. So you see here one of the screenshots of the model with the various parameters that can be adjusted on various parameters. I'm not going to go into detail on that now, but don't hesitate to reach out to us. And you also see the details that you find in there on the auctioning, the free allocation volumes, and so on, by country and by sector, etc. But we'll show you the results now in the presentation. So first of all, if we move to the overall supply structure and the changes in the supply structure, you see here the 4 scenarios on the left-hand side with all of the various supply, and that this is the total for 2021 to 2030. And you see how the total slightly differs between the proposals and the final deal, and mostly how the structure changes. The final ETS deal is quite close to the Commission and the Council proposal in this respect. The member state auctions, the free allocations are very similar in a way. And you do see differences like the social climate fund, which was not included in the Commission proposal. The Parliament proposal was different, particularly with the higher linear reduction factor. And there were some differences also for the social fund that was also not in there, and so on. So this is the overall view on the market supply in total. If we look specifically at the surplus, which of course has a lot of importance, you see how the surplus evolves very similarly in the final ETS deal compared to the Commission's and the Council proposals. Whereas the Parliament proposal was with a higher linear reduction factor and much lower surplus, with a surplus reducing gradually until 2030. This is really the objective of the Commission's proposal, was to try to stabilize the surplus around 500 to 600 million allowances. And if we look then at the overall graph with the overall supply-demand balance for the final ETS deal, You see here the overall cap gradually reducing. You see the annual supply, which is slowly increasing until 27 and then gradually decreasing again. Annual demand decreasing over time, and how the surplus decreases to this value that we talked about just earlier. So if we then turn to the national auctioning volumes, so what are the main changes compared to the final ETS deal? In the Commission proposal, there's slightly higher national auctioning volumes because of lower linear reduction factors and no distribution to social climate fund. In the Parliament proposal, slightly lower auctioning volumes due to this higher linear reduction factor, the ocean funds, and the decrease of the upper threshold of the MSR. And in the Council proposal, the national auctioning volumes are slightly higher due to the lower linear reduction factor. And so here you see the difference between the final ETS deal and the Commission proposal. And you see how the final ETS has a slightly lower on average, but 0.4%. So very, very small differences on average, slightly higher if you look at the various member states. In general, the higher linear reduction factor slightly reduces the volume for most of the member states, but particularly for lower income member states, the impact is somewhat mitigated due to the redistribution of the modernization funds. And for highest income members, of course, the opposite applies, which you see here. If we turn to the difference compared to the Parliament proposal, here there's an increase. So there's a slight increase in auctioning volumes, which is mainly due to the less stringent reduction factor. If we then turn to the changes in the free allocation volumes, also looking at per member state and per sector, here you see first the free allocation phase-out rates and how they differ across the 4 scenarios. You see how the Commission had a plan from 2025 to 2030 a more linear phase-out rates compared to the Commission and compared to the Council and the Parliament proposal, which were closer to the final deal, which is not linear and reducing much faster after 28. But there is a broader scope in the Parliament proposal, so with more sectors included. And so this converts to this difference here compared to the Commission proposal. So the final ETS deal increases the free allocations with the lower phase-out rates. And so you see how that's positive for all of the countries. And in comparison, the Parliament proposal here, actually the percentage is very small, so the bars look big, but it's a very small difference because the final ETS deal is close to the European Parliament proposal in terms of phase-out rates. And so if you look at those numbers cumulatively for the free allocations per sector, you see here how the sectors that are included in the CBAM have a difference here between the final ETS deal and the Commission proposal of roughly 6%, again due to this different phase-out rates. So that's the case for steel, cement, fertilizers, and aluminium. Hydrogen, on the other hand, was added compared to the Commission's proposal, so there's an increase here in the free allocations. And if we do if we look at that, summing up the auctioning and the free allocation volumes per member states, you see how the final ETS deal has a positive net impact for all member states. Well, pretty much, or slightly close to zero. Of course, some of them are very low in terms of amounts, with the big countries having more installations and a higher impact. But it's clearly the free allocation increase that has an impact mostly on those bigger countries and also higher income countries like Germany, France, and Italy, where the net is positive for all of them. So this is the final output we wanted to share. In terms of next steps, well, we'll publish the updated model with the 4 scenarios. on our website. We'll, of course, we encourage you to use the model. Don't hesitate to reach out if you have feedback or questions on the model. And we'll continue, of course, communicating on those results ourselves as well. Yeah, we look forward to the discussion in the panel. My colleague Simon will be there. He will be happy to answer to your questions. Sam, that was it from my side. I give the word back to you.
Thank you very much, Julien, for the presentation and the overview. There's a lot of meat there, a lot of things to unpack. And we'll move to the panel discussion. I'll hand over to Sabine, who will be moderating that. Thanks.
Yes, a good morning from me, Julien. You stayed well within your time frame, so I allow myself one question to you before you actually leave, which I understand you have to do. What did you yourself find surprising or particularly interesting in your findings?
Well, I mean, I mentioned first of all, the surplus implications, of course, are always interesting to look at because you see the difference between what the Commission and the Parliament were suggesting, and that's a very striking figure. And we're not looking into prices implications because that's, of course, very difficult to forecast. But it's clear that the surplus levels and the prices are very connected. And so if the objective is to increase the speed of the transition, it's clear that we would want to have a slightly lower surplus and higher prices to give more fuel to all of the various funds that are connected to these auctioning prices and so on. So that's, I would say, an important note. So that the final deal is closer to what the Commission and the Council were proposing. Yeah, I think that's my main message right now. But you know, all of the other.
And who do you expect to use your model in particular? For who would it be particularly interesting?
Well, I think industry experts or NGOs that are connected to the debates, I think can really learn a lot from the details of how the impact of slight changes in the assumptions can really change quite importantly the outputs. And again, all of the ETS has become very complex. There are so many assumptions involved, so many elements that allow ultimately the Commission to tweak the evolution. You know many of these complexities. So I think our model allows to give quite a simple and clear overview of these impacts. So I think anyone who would want to understand those in more detail could really use the model.
Okay, thanks very much, Julien, for that outlook on the use of the model. And with that, I'll let you go.
Thank you.
But we still have a colleague of yours present who can answer further questions about the findings so far and the use of the model, namely Simon Lalieu. We now turn to a panel with well, quite a few, I'd say, veterans of following the legislative process around the ETS and, of course, the wider policy field as well. This particular panel is still about the review, about digesting what has happened with the ETS review and what we can garner as being the results from the model. We have about 30 minutes for this first panel, and then there'll be 10 minutes for questions and answers at the end. So invitation here to the participants, please put your questions as succinctly as possible in the Q&A function of the Zoom, and they will be picked up by my colleagues, and I'll try and cover as many as possible of them. So now to the panel, we have with us Camille Maury, who is Senior Policy Officer at WWF's European Policy Office. We have Ola Hansén, Director of Public Affairs at H2 Green Steel. I think we usually refer to you as being a representative of progressive industry because you aim to produce fossil-free steel. No doubt you will be explaining a bit more what your company does. We also have with us Benjamin Denis, who is Senior Policy Advisor and Head of Industrial Policy Coordination at IndustriAll Europe, the trade union representing the workers in industrial sectors. I'd like to start off with the same question to all of you, starting with Camille. Perhaps you've listened to the presentation by Climact, which helps us assess the ETS1 agreement better. What struck you in the numbers that were just presented? And Julien already said it's about supply-demand balance, it's not about prices. Nevertheless, the question, is there anything in particular missing that you think this model should elucidate? And then you can move on perhaps to give us your broader view on the outcomes of the ETS. What do you consider the biggest strengths and the biggest weaknesses? So Camille first, then Ola, then Benjamin, and Simon, you'll be there to help out with any more explanations to questions that arise in these responses. Thanks a lot. So over to Camille for now.
Thanks a lot, Sabine. First of all, hello everyone to everyone from my side. Thanks a lot for the invitation, and I'm very happy to be here to discuss the final ETS deal that was reached last year at the end of 2022. Yes, so to first answer your question on what struck me from what was presented, actually there are like two things. The first one being like still the amount of allowances that will be given to industry based on the final deal which was reached because of exactly what was explained by Climact, the fact that the phase out of free allowances was slower than was proposed by the European Parliament. So this idea that we will have a slower phase out of free allocation for the CBAM sector shows that actually the main ETS sector will still receive quite some amount of free allowances until at least so 2014 for the CBAM sector. So this is still quite shocking, let's say, because actually we are in a climate crisis, so the polluters pay principles should be finally enforced, and it's what we hoped for during the last revision. The second thing is the amount of revenue that will be actually made, like let's say the ETS cash that the EU member states will receive. And also maybe one last thing is the fact that this revision also shows that we strengthened the cap through this revision and we had an increase of the linear reduction factor. And this is also maybe one good outcome of this ETS deal. So those are the 3 points. So if I go back maybe to the shortcomings of this revision, I will maybe start with the free allocation phase out, because this was one big thing, at least from the NGO perspective. We really hoped for a sooner phase out of the free allocation for both ETS and CBAM sector. We really advocated for the polluters pay principle to be finally applied. So it was not the case, because now, despite the fact that the phase out date will start in 2026 for the CBAM sector, it will only end in 2034. This is way too long, and this will allow industry to receive free allocation in the next decade. When actually it has been shown that free allocation didn't help when it comes to industrial decarbonization, especially for those sectors. And also many companies made a lot of windfall profits with those free allocations. So this money could have been spent in a better way. And we would have hoped that we had this money, this free allocation fully auctioned, so that it could have been actually put forward with through the innovation fund in order to help industrial decarbonization. So that's the first thing. And I think one of the, let's say, positive thing which happened with the with the ETS deal was also that for the first time we have a conditionality requirements which have been put in place within the ETS. However, those conditionality requirements are quite weak. Indeed, companies will only have to comply with the energy efficiency audits. And if they don't comply with those energy efficiency audits, well, they will still receive up to 80% of their share of free allocation. So, like the number of by how much we actually diminish the free allocation for the companies who don't comply with those energy audits is quite low. And we would have hoped as well that the climate neutrality plans would apply for all installation, not only for the worst performers, as it has been agreed. So that's one thing. Maybe the second thing goes back to also what has been shown by Climact, which is the number of ETS revenue that would be made by member states. So as the price goes up, normally ETS revenue will be higher for member states. One good thing is that for the first time, actually, college stater agreed that we will have this ETS cash spent 100% on climate action. Before, actually, in 2018, it was agreed that only 50% should be at least spent on climate action. So this is a good start. Or whether what constitutes a climate action is still not clearly defined by the ETS directive. And within this revision, actually, it's still up to the member state to decide what they clearly see as climate spending. And this is something that we see as a shortcoming. It would have been more helpful to really define what is climate, what is the climate action, and how we can spend this ETS money. So I think
Camille, we'll be coming to this question of the spending of the revenues again later. You'll have another chance to talk about it. Thanks a lot for those first points. I had one comment in the chat that that your audio is worth improving. I personally still could hear you, but others said it was hard to understand you. So maybe while the others speak, you could try and do something about this. Let me turn to Ola then. You will rebound on what you've heard from Climact, but maybe also respond to some of what Camille said. Of course, it would be interesting to hear whether industry takes a similar view on what happened to the phase out of free allocation in particular. But Ola, go ahead, and you're welcome to say a few words, of course, about your company.
Yeah, and do I understand, like, first comment on the presentation and then to list a few strengths and weaknesses of the revised ETS directive? Good, then I got my task right. Then yes, coming from a company called H2 Green Steel, being sort of launched in Sweden, we plan to, actually we're a purpose-driven industrial scale-up. So our first plant will be located in northern Sweden, but the plan is to decarbonize several the hard to abate sectors in general, and really have different plants in Europe and also worldwide. And so we start with steel, using then renewable hydrogen as a basis, and not initially reaching all the way to zero emissions, but going to 95% compared to the blast furnace, so the best blast furnaces in Europe. So a really significant decrease of the emissions. And I think we are not sort of in a very, we're here and now. The work has started. We have permit. We have purchased all the equipment, both the hydrogen plant, the iron plant, and the steel plant. And we're now awaiting to take the final investment decision very soon. And the plan is to have the plant up and running in 2025 with commercial operation very late 2025 or early 2026. So things are moving fast on our side. ETS is of course crucial for us, bringing new technology in EU, where sort of the existing industries have large emissions and big free allocation. But first, sort of a comment on the presentation. I think surprising, it was in a way disappointing and surprising to see that the amount, if you talk about use of auction revenues, the amount going to the innovation fund, that I think could be a harmonized EU-wide level playing field tool to sort of boost investments. When it came to the final outcome, it was the least ambitious council, sort of that was closest to actually how many allowances that will be dedicated in an innovation fund, of course, reducing the size of that fund. But still, I think noting there, if I got the figures right, it was more than 700 million allowances available during the period. So if front loaded, it could still be a really significant contribution here. And I think it's something we would like to investigate further. I think really investments is a long-term cycle. So the more of this funds you can bring forward, especially now with the new competitive bidding mechanism that the Commission is working on, providing sort of compared to the US IRA, for example, just which grants a certain number of support, then the whole ambition of this competitive bidding mechanism is to use the state aid really wisely on an EU-wide scale and really give state aid to the ones that are the most efficient and can sort of make the investments with least state aid. And I think that's a really basis for building both a green and competitive industry going forward in the US. So I think that was what I took with me from the presentation. When it comes to the revised ETS, I think a good strength that we see is at least that they kept the linear reduction factor, the amount where the sort of the decrease of the cap at a rather ambitious level. And if you prolong this, the current now decided level post 2030, you see that there will be no free allowances distributed after 2039, meaning that you actually will sort of have a zero cap in the ETS by 2039, which is, I think, really ambitious. And a lot of people don't think about this, that really, if you don't invest to really reach zero in the end, you will not have a viable industry operation in Europe after 2039. So, and I think we were disappointed and pushing together with the NGOs for a faster phase out of the free allocation, but still it's significant now that finally a real price of CO2 emissions will be phased in the industry. I think it's crucial. We would have liked to see it much faster, but still already by 2030, there will be 50% of the free allocation almost will be gone in a way, which will, in addition to the lowering of the cap, the industry players will need to go to the market. They will push the prices up. So we will have, I believe, a significant cost for emissions in the EU in near term here. And then I think the final positive outcome was that it's now really clear that the ETS must ensure a level playing field for installations using decarbonized technologies. And this needs to be arranged in detailed legislation, like the Delegated Act for Free Allocation rules, which are still ongoing, but still the direction there is really positive. And I think it's a prerequisite for the investments we need to see in the industry for decarbonized. I think I was into the disappointments, of course, is that the free allocation didn't move faster. And I think a disappointment also is that the auction revenues could be better used on the EU-wide scale rather than a member state level, especially when it comes to spurring investments. I think we need to see investments in all countries, of course, but we also need to see a level playing field and secure the single market. And now we see a big disturbance here. So I think the innovation fund to really grow that a lot could be a way forward, and we didn't really see that in the legislation.
Thank you, Ola. So a second disappointed voice about the speed of the phase out of free allocation. Now I wonder what Benjamin Denis will say about that. Over to you. Same set of questions, reaction to the presentation, strengths and weaknesses, but by all means, start off with a little bit of background on your organization.
Yeah, first, thank you for the invitation, and thank you to Julien and the Climact team for the really interesting presentation. As far as I'm concerned, my end of June brain would need a bit more time to digest all the figures that were presented, especially because I'm not involved in a daily basis on the super technical details of the ETS reform. But speaking on behalf of trade unions, I would like to say that in this debate, we are a bit agnostic. For us, the proof of the pudding is in the eating. We will have to see what will happen in the ground, at the shop floor level, at the company level, whether the ETS, the revised ETS and the other EU instruments will really entail a massive wave of investment in technologies and infrastructures that are in line with the climate neutrality target. This is, at the end of the day, for us, the key dimension to assess the reforms. ETS is not an end in itself; it's a means to an end. Among other policy instruments, we could end up with a perfect ETS. Theoretically speaking, presented with beautiful PowerPoints, with no more surplus, with a carbon price reaching the sky. If at the end of the day, in the real world, it would lead to a decarbonization through delocalization, it would not help to fix the many problems we have ahead of us. As trade unions, of course, we care about the location of industry, about employment. Energy-intensive industries represent in EU nowadays a bit more than 7 million of jobs. These are usually good, qualified jobs, well-paid jobs. So energy-intensive industries are really key for the EU prosperity. We also would like to remind that those foundation industries, those that are covered by the ETS, not mentioning aviation and maritime, even though we also represent aerospace, workers from aerospace industries and workers from the shipbuilding industry, but focusing on energy-intensive industries, these industries are also instrumental to reach the Green Deal objectives. And are also instrumental in building the EU open strategy. So we really need to think to the ETS reform in a broader context, a context that will indeed put the EU in line, on track to really reach the 2050 neutrality target, because as Camille rightly said, climate urgency is there, the clock is ticking, obviously. But on the other hand, we also know that we are in the middle of multiple crises, with cost of living crisis, with a quite uncertain geopolitical context, with EU elections next year that might bring to the parliament a series of anti-EU populistic forces that could, at the end of the day, completely undermine all the Green Deal agenda. Hence, the need to try to combine as much as we can the social acceptance agenda with the climate agenda. And so in the context of the ETS reform, I will not repeat what other speakers rightly said about the importance of having a clear and stable carbon price as part of the policy jigsaw, because we believe that it is needed to really trigger the investments we need, keeping in mind that energy-intensive industries are capital-intensive industries with long-term investment cycles. So obviously, if we want to be able to decarbonize those industries on time, investments must take place in the coming years, in the coming decade. Now, in terms of positive developments, we could also mention indeed the fact that additional auctioning revenues should be made available to support the decarbonization of those sectors and maybe also to mitigate some of their possible adverse impacts. But there are a series of blind spots that I would like to mention rather than weaknesses. Conditionalities indeed have been put in the legislation. Now we would like to see and to closely monitor what the revised ETS mean for the 15,000 stationary installations that are covered by the EU ETS and their workforce. Do we have plans? Do we have negotiated agreements to anticipate change in those 15,000 sites, or do we just simply bet on the market forces? I also would like to mention the regional impacts, for which we would like to have a bit more granularity in the monitoring. I have some sympathy with what has been said by the previous speaker about the need to keep the integrity on the EU single market. Fair enough. The need also to focus public money on state aids that will be spent wisely. But we also would like to see the climate policy in general being in line with cohesion objectives. Because the reality in the north of Sweden is one thing, and we are seeing extremely interesting developments there. But it's fair to acknowledge that situation is completely different in other countries with a different energy mix, with different domestic energy resources and geographical opportunities and constraints. And we would like to closely monitor what the revised ETS impact on all those regions will be, in line also with what is done in the context of the Just Transition Platform and Just Transition Fund. Last but not least, decarbonization and ETS implementation is not happening in a vacuum. We need to factor in a series of other factors: energy cost, first and foremost, the supply of affordable clean energy is really a key enabling factor across the board to decarbonized energy, and we have still some doubt about that aspect, to say the least. Same with the cost of raw materials. And what is happening in other major economies. We mentioned Inflation Reduction Act. We could also mention other major economies, notably China. CBAM, of course, is part of the answer, but is not the whole story. We need also to closely monitor what is done in those regions. And social conditionality will be key at the end of the day. If we want to be successful with the Green Deal agenda and with the 2050 climate neutrality target, we need to keep society on board. And keeping society on board will only be possible if we attach strong conditionalities for all the support which is given to industries in the context of the ETS, but also more broadly in the context of the EU Green Deal Industrial Plan and the Net Zero Industry Act, because we have to be as demanding with clean tech technologies as we are with energy intensive industries. It's absolutely key for us.
Thank you, Benjamin. Simon, I feel that our speakers did not take too much issue with the model that was presented, but nevertheless, quick question to you. Do you, from the perspective of the work you have done at Climact, do you want to respond to anything that has been said before I move on to further questions to the others?
Yeah, thank you, Sabine. Thank you for Carbon Market Watch for the opportunity. Yeah, just two short reaction. First on Innovation Fund. So as Julien presented, indeed, the Innovation Fund, the final ETS is lower than the Commission and the European Parliament proposals. It's more or less 700 million allowances. It's more than the Council proposal. The main differences between those innovation funds for the different scenario come from the phase-out allowances that goes to this innovation fund, and we saw in the presentation that there is different CBAM rates that leads to different innovation funds. So main point on innovation fund, and to directly answer to a question from the participants, from Mr. Lestrade. Yes, we provide, the model provides, the free allocation per sector, included the sector that are not covered by the CBAM. As you can see, the refineries or the polymers are not covered by the CBAM, but the model present the cumulative free allocation per sector and per member states. And that's it for the things I wanted to add.
Okay, you already picked on a question from the audience Q&A, which is yet a bit more precise. The person asking wanted to know what is the volume of free allocation which will not be concerned by the carbon border adjustment mechanism. In other words, where there will be no phase out quickly. Does anybody have that figure at hand? Can we answer that?
Oh, yeah, the total sum of the model provided, but I don't have the figure, sorry. But it's very, very simple to extract from the model.
Okay, I'm turning to my colleague Sam. He might have it at hand. I know we've got it somewhere in our publications as well, but I don't have it at my fingertips. If not,
Me neither, not on top of my mind, no.
Not on the top of your head either. Okay, but it's significant. Let's say it's significant. Okay, we all know where to look for the precise figure. Then let me turn back to the other speakers. Benjamin, Denis said quite poignantly, the ETS is not an end in itself, and we've all seen in the legislative process that it is not really about creating the perfect ETS, how climate economists have envisaged it, right? Otherwise, yeah, free allocation would be phased out by now already, and we would already have a much higher carbon price. But there's always tools built in. There's tools built into the ETS to alleviate some of the pains or to help create some of the other conditions for the decarbonization to happen. Let's look at these a bit. So, for example, we have the introduction of the carbon border adjustment mechanism to help with the phase out of free allocation. Ola, how does that look from your perspective? Does the introduction of the CBAM alleviate fears about carbon leakage sufficiently? Does it sufficiently reassure industry about being able to compete at global level?
I think for us, and I mean, both the installation we're planning in Iberia and the north of Sweden, they have Europe as the main market in a way. So we expect to export very minor volumes really in a way. So I think, but I have sympathy for other industry worried about sort of that have a larger share of export going abroad of sort of the consequence, how CBAM will sort of address that part. But I think we should not forget that the major trade in EU is on the inner EU market really. So I think then the main aspect of CBAM is that it really needs to work really. We need to be able to, it needs really to work for us to introduce a carbon price in all sectors really, or not all sectors, but at least the major high emitting industry sectors. So in that sense, I think it's really crucial if we don't see a similar development in the rest of the world, that CBAM is introduced as planned and functions well. That's the only way.
Where does the doubt, if I can interrupt you, where does the doubt come from? Why does the doubt prevail that CBAM might not work?
No, I have no doubt. I think it has all the abilities to work well. And I think we've seen already now with the battery regulation, similar sort of reporting requirements. It's not a payment requirement in a way, but the same kind of value chain requirements on emission reporting. I think it could be complicated. You need a lot of new players need to develop new tools and new skills in a way on reporting. But I see no hinder for it to work really. But I think it's more that we need to make sure for EU really to spur the investments we need in the industry to go green, we need to introduce the carbon price. And to do that, we really need the CBAM to function. So I think it's more I urge everyone to make the best effort to really try to make it work.
So you wonder more about the effect of the CBAM on the EU's trading partner and whether more carbon pricing mechanisms will be developed in partner countries.
Yeah, ideally, I mean, that it has a dual purpose. Firstly, to be able to introduce a carbon price in the industry sectors that have sort of international competition, but also it has the ambition to spur sort of carbon pricing in other regions of the world as well. So ideally, we will see both of these things happening going forward. I think, but just I think we all need to sort of bring our part to making the CBAM work. It's more that what I want to highlight.
Okay, thank you, Ola. Then another complementary policy to the ETS is the social climate fund. Benjamin, you've already touched on the fact that the ETS needs to be implemented with social justice in mind. It needs to be compatible with the interests of workers in the industries and the wider populations benefiting from those industries. Do you think that the Social Climate Fund will be large enough to support vulnerable households and workers affected by the energy transition, which the ETS helps bring about? And also, is it likely to be spent well enough?
Yeah. First of all, the Climate Social Fund was not a priority for us. Let's be clear, because first we believe that the key demand we have in that debate again is to find the right policy jigsaw to combine a quick and deep decarbonization with a just transition agenda. And for that, you need to have a transformative agenda, an investment agenda. You need to train people. You need to anticipate change. But yeah, we really need to combine this sustainable policy agenda with investment and a just transition agenda. That's why we have insisted to have social conditionalities in the ETS, the fact that the provision of free allowances should be made conditional to a series of social requirements. The Social Climate Fund, in our understanding, is something else. The Social Climate Fund has been proposed to mitigate the possible social impact on of ETS2, the ETS that will be created to put a carbon price on the fuel use in road transport and domestic heating. Let's be clear, better with the Social Climate Fund than without. But at the beginning, we were extremely reluctant regarding the use of a carbon pricing scheme such as the ETS2 to decarbonize road transport and heating for different reasons. But first, because we are already in a cost of living crisis, where a series of households are struggling with high energy bills, struggling with difficulties to have access to mobility. And we don't believe that a carbon pricing instrument was the right approach. Now, if we decide to set up an EU-wide carbon pricing to decarbonize those sectors, design matters, and there are options to mitigate the social impact and the recycling of revenues in one of those aspects. We didn't make yet kind of quantitative assessment to know whether what is set aside in the Social Climate Fund will be enough to compensate the impact. But again, this will not happen in a vacuum. What we already see nowadays is that more and more people in Europe have difficulty to get access to mobility, notably to individual mobility, which remains absolutely key for a significant number of people, those living in rural areas, living in suburbs areas, not well connected to public transport, those workers working with extreme flexible working time, those working during the night, those having to work really early in the morning. All those people do not always have the possibility to have access to public transport. So they rely on individual transport. Individual transport becomes more and more expensive for different reasons, notably the upmarket drift. I will not open discussions that would go much beyond the topic of the discussion today, but what I want to say is that if we continue with the same trends that we have seen for the last 2 decades, higher precariousness on the labor market, uncertainty, cost of living crisis, polarization regarding access to mobility and housing, I think that it's a mistake to believe that the Social Climate Fund will be enough to to fix all those social problems. And again, also macroeconomic policy matters. We see in a series of countries that all the state aid which is provided to multinational companies to attract investment will be compensated by a series of cuts in public budgets, by a series of measures also to, for instance, postpone the retiring age. All those measures will have social impacts, and Social Climate Fund will not make a huge difference, but better with than without.
Benjamin, thanks very much. A very clear answer. You say the Social Climate Fund will not be sufficient to solve all the problems that will arise with the introduction of the ETS for road transport and buildings. And with that, you've also answered one of the other audience questions that we have on what could be the consequences of including those sectors in the ETS. Your outlook there is relatively critical, I'd say. We have only time for one more question, which I will address to Camille. Camille, originally I wanted to ask you more about the use of ETS revenues by the member states, but I now allow myself to be spontaneous and to ask you about what happens now that we have the key legislation, the revision in place. There's implementation to be done. There's implementing legislation to be crafted. What do we need to understand there? What details are still being hammered out now, and in what way are they critical? Can you answer that for us to conclude this first panel?
Thanks, Sabine, and I hope you can hear me a bit better now. I will try my best. Apparently I have problems with my microphone, so apologies. Yes, indeed. So we have the final deal agreed by co-legislator, but now the Commission also has to draft a number of implementing acts. One of them is actually the climate neutrality plans for the conditionality for actually the worst performers, the 20 worst performers. So right now the Commission, together with an expert group, is drafting this act. There will be also a revision of benchmark of the key benchmark, especially for key sector like steel and cement. That is also happening, and we hope to have this, at least the Commission hopes to have this done by the end of this year. And this is key because the benchmark revision will also be key in order to see for which sector, as Ola was flagging this before, which sector will receive free allocation based on the revision of the benchmark. So I would say that both of those are key, but also next to that, we have the carbon border adjustment mechanism with a number of implementing acts to come. I think there is up to 15 implementing acts on various aspects of the carbon border adjustment mechanism. And in order for the ETS and the fee allocation phase out to work out, I imagine that the interlink between the CBAM and the ETS and how those implementing acts will come forward will be key. Yeah, I will stop here.
Thanks a lot, Camille. So there remains a lot to watch for the people here on the panel and others in the wider policy community. This was obviously, not enough time to go into fantastic detail. I'm sure you would all love to jump on what you have mutually said. I'm thinking, as Camille mentioned, the ETS benchmark revision, surely Ola would also have views on that, but we've run out of time. This first panel is concluded. We're now going into a break of 15 minutes. Thank you all very much. Most of you are staying with us. We're only saying a proper goodbye to Simon Lalieu at this point. Thank you very much. And we'll be welcoming 2 new people for the subsequent panel. Thanks very much. Have a good break. In 15 minutes, 11:15, we'll see each other again for the continuation.
Thank you. Goodbye.
So welcome back, everybody, to the second part of this webinar. We have not lost anybody as far as I can see. We're still at about 80 people listening to this event. It is now my great pleasure to welcome Pahle, climate economist and advisor with a focus on carbon pricing at the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact and Research. In the European Union, I suppose, actually, like everywhere else, we can never rest on our laurels very long. We never have a long breathing space after having taken one major legislative hurdles, or in the case of the Fit for 5 package, actually several legislative hurdles. We have to think on to the next period in climate policy making, and we have to think on to the ETS after its current review, already think of the next review. And you, Michael, you have published a paper which has given many people in the EU already good food for thought. It is on the emerging end game, the EU ETS on the road towards climate neutrality. And we will hear the juicy bits from that from you now before we join into a next panel discussion. Michael, over to you.
You can hear me now. Yeah, thanks so much, Sabine and colleagues, for inviting me and giving me the opportunity to talk a little bit about what we call the endgame in a recent paper. And the idea of calling it the endgame is to realize that the ETS will soon come to an end, at least what is regarded in terms of the allowances that are issued, but it also conveys a strong sense of urgency and immediacy. And it's indeed, I think, the situation we are in. And already I myself, as a bystanding researcher, seem to be out of breath in light of what's going on. I cannot imagine how it is for regulators and lawmakers. It's, I think, extremely busy times, but also exciting times. I use this as a pretext to get into my presentation. So what's next for ETS policymaking? After the reform is before the reform, as we know. And I would like to start with shortly summarizing where we stand, and I'm not doing this in my own words, but I'm quoting carbon price coverage here, which I think summarized this quite nicely. So a couple of reforms, the MSR, the declining cap, and the block's dedication, not to forget, have achieved a situation where we collectively see as contributing to maintaining more stable carbon prices. This has not all come together. It was a sequence. It was hard work, but we are in a pretty good state now. We do have high carbon prices. We have stable carbon prices that remain stable even in political turmoil. And I think that's basically all we need to ask or want to have from a system like that to call it effective and fit. So I think we are in a pretty good state. And the question is how to make it fitter if the need be. And related to that, how to ensure that this stability that we have achieved remains on through the next decade. And you already mentioned the work that we've been doing, and part of the work is a numerical analysis using an ETS model. And surprisingly, in this model, it always looks nice. It's not the feature of our model, but that is the feature of many models because they are well ordered, well structured. And a typical result is that you have a carbon price that rises smoothly and gradually over time. So that's also the case in our results. We expect from the model results to have a price of 130 euro per ton in 2030. You need to correct for inflation, and a price of 200 euro per ton in 2040. And if it would unfold like this in reality, I think we would be pretty well off and on a very good way towards achieving the Green Deal. So far so good. That's the model. So now the aim of my talk is to look behind the model and to critically reflect on the assumptions and what's going on in the mechanics of it. And the first thing to mention is this, and I already said this at the very beginning, is to realize that the cap will go down very rapidly, at least compared to what we had before. So the cap in the sectors we are talking about will approach zero new allowances by 2039. That's why we are calling it the end game, because it's essentially around the corner. I think it's important to point out that this is not the full story. There's also the aviation cap, which will take a little bit longer and will only go down to 0 by 2045. But the cumulative sum of allowances that will be issued from the aviation cap is relatively small. So I think it's fair to say to pin it down to 2040 roundabout. And what's the impact of this? It's pretty clear in anticipation that something comes to an end promptly. You cannot help but form expectations about it. So the first important point to make is that we must not talk anymore of post-2030 as something in the faraway future, which we do not need to concern about it, and that we can actually separate the discussions into something that happens before 2030 and something that happens after 2030, because they're all intermixed and intermingled now. So you cannot separate, you have to discuss the whole period through the end. And I think that's one of the main challenges, just adding to the task that so many things need to be dealt with at the moment. Yeah, and I already mentioned that the really crucial rule is our expectations. What do firms expect going forward from the ETS, from the market, from the political situation as a whole? Because there's this strong interdependence of how firms expect the future, behave, that is, invest towards the future, and the future they create with it. So it's a simple economic logic that prices reflect expectations, and by acting in line with expectations, you change prices. So this is cyclical behavior. And what we want to achieve for the sake of stability and for functioning and achieving the goals is that we actually, or one could say essentially, want firms to see the ETS and the transition more broadly as an opportunity, because this in turn would guarantee stability, which would only lead to more opportunities. So this is a virtuous cycle we are interested in. And just to give you an idea of how things stand, showing on the left side of the slide the results from a recent survey by the European Investment Bank. I think the situation right now is mixed. There is perception of opportunity but risk. But the details do not matter. I think for us, it's more important to have the right direction, and then that is to develop and discuss the development of the ETS in a direction that will create opportunity rather than enforce risk. And with that in mind, it makes a lot of sense to talk about the next decade, which is actually also this decade, if you link it to expectations, in terms of what would be pressure points for this opportunity. Or you could also say, tapping the potential of options for opportunity, if you want to use a more optimistic framing. But either way, it's the important point is to be aware and anticipate what will come up and what is idiosyncratic for carbon markets. And there are 3-4 points I'd like to make in the remainder of the session. And just to manage some expectations, I have just one slide for a point, so this will not be endless talking. The first one is trading when supply approaches zero. That's pretty obvious. Alone from the graph that I showed you previously in our model results. I will also talk about carbon removals, international cooperation, social concerns. I did not have the time to attend the first part of the event, so there might be some redundancy. My apologies if it's too redundant. But since it's only just one slide, so
don't worry, Michael. The first presentation very much concentrated on supply and demand balance and left price developments out. So your focus here on price developments is perfect.
Yeah, actually, I will not talk about prices at all, but about factors underlying prices. But nevertheless, let's see. So the first point that I mentioned is trading when supply approaches zero, and that's a very straightforward intuition when the market becomes tighter and tighter. So what will happen with trading and price formation? And it's also very intuitive to think if there's not much to trade on and a high interest, then people might get all kind of weird and crazy ideas what they want to do and how they could game and manipulate the market potentially. So that is what is lying ahead of us when the market gets tighter, which it will get structurally, and it makes the occurrence of high volatility and manipulation more likely. We also know from simulations so far only, but I think on good grounds, that the MSR is bound to cut into that behavior. So namely, in anticipation of a much tighter cap, the bank will grow, so firms will buy more certificates to prepare for the scarcity in the coming decade. And as it is assigned currently, it will delete, the MSR will cut into this banking, which is actually economically efficient. So it's not a historic surplus anymore, but it's efficient banking. And so we need to be concerned about this because the MSR as it is only would exacerbate this effect. We had a big debate and speculation in the past. I have no need to recap that. It led to, among other things, to some elements in the reform. We now have a continuous monitoring by ESMA looking at potential market manipulation. We also have the MSR review upcoming. So these are trigger points that already exist and that we should make use of. So that's good. But on a more taking a more revolutionary angle, I think it's open to discussion if we want to stay on with the type of stability mechanisms that we already have. So so far it's all pretty much quantity based. We see some first movements in the direction of price based mechanisms in the ETS too. But I think it would be worthwhile even to do more radically thinking on moving on to a more price-based or actually in core price-based system to ensure market stability. There are interesting options. It must not be a hard price collar that is typically discussed. It could be a soft collar that would spare us a lot of the political anonymity problems, for instance, and there are systems like that already in place. For instance, California, basically in all systems around the world, I think something like that is in place. So it's not completely new. And one could also ask if we want something that's not just purely reactive, but also has elements that are forward-looking, like, for instance, something like forward guidance, akin to what central banks are doing. And that again would raise the governance question. So I don't want to raise too many questions here, but you already see there's a lot to discuss in terms of how to move on with price stability.
Michael, may I, before you move on, because it fits, I have an audience question here, which might be more difficult to pick up later. Yeah. It's from Citizens Climate Europe, and it's a question about a price floor and whether the ETS would be more effective with a steadily rising price floor. Would it provide greater predictability and increased chance of overachieving the emissions reductions? I think it's a bit of a hypothetical question, but you might have an answer to that.
So I deliberately spoke of a collar, so a price floor and a ceiling, because I think it does not make sense to have the floor without a ceiling and vice versa. So it's really a symmetrical issue, and the idea of having a collar is to prevent extreme price events and situations that could lead to political backlash and destabilize the system. So I think they both need to come together. That's the short answer. Maybe we can come back to that.
Thank you. I'm glad we ticked that off in the moment when it fitted. Please go on.
Yeah, so moving on to carbon removals, probably doesn't come as a surprise that I talk about carbon removals here. Many people are talking about it at the moment, and it also, in a sense, derives or becomes immediate when thinking about the endgame and its logic. So at some point we will end up, or in the final state, however it looks like, we will certainly have some residual emissions, so emissions that could not be reduced through new technology, that somehow have to be captured and stored. So that's the case, the main case for having carbon removals. We're already pretty aware of the challenges, so we do not know the potential, and there's substantial cost uncertainty. To give you an idea about the numbers, I took figures from the very recent report by the European Scientific Advisory Board on climate change that appeared last week, that also proposes a 2040 target, by the way, but I skipped that for sake of time here. And the uncertainty, but that's nothing new. But what is really new and idiosyncratic to carbon removals is non-permanency, and related to that, the integrity risk. So we have some very solid and permanent ways of carbon removal if we store it underground, so if we sequester, but then there are a lot of nature-based solutions and other solutions which we really have no idea about how long they will last. And this backs or gives rise to an integrity risk. Here again, this does not need to be approached from the very early on. So there's already process going on, certification process, and I think also consultation process. But the big question, of course, is integration into the ETS. And I personally think it's not a matter of if, but when and how. But that's my own view. And I think what is essential here is the liability risk especially for non-permanent removal. So when you could, for instance, remove non-permanently and then get a certificate. So how is that liability organized? So who's really responsible for guaranteeing that this will be perpetually renewed or sold back? Some colleagues, including PIC's director, have proposed to implement a carbon central bank specifically for this. I think it's quite an interesting idea, and again, relates to governance issues. And it's also worthwhile to point out that in California, there are specific policy proposals already on the table that specifically address the liability issue, which I think are very helpful to get the discussion started. So the third point, and this is now getting a bit more inconvenient potentially, but nonetheless, hopefully good food for discussion. So Europe is not acting in isolation, as everyone knows, but we have a global problem, and it's good for us that we make considerable progress and that we can live up to our aspiration to be a climate leader. At the same time, we are realizing that progress on the international level is lacking. We're moving farther and farther away from what we would need to achieve the 2 or even the 1.5 degree. So I think farther down the road, at some point, it will be asked on the issue of the new ETS, especially if it becomes salient for households. There will be questions, or there will be concerns about political support, and they will be linked to making progress. So it's not the issue in itself, but it's really how this interacts with higher emission in ETS. And I think there's a particular opportunity with review to CMEM, which is so far, I mean, it's underdefined, that's pretty clear. It had to be negotiated in a glimpse of a time. So a lot of things to be discussed, but my overall impression, and I'm not an expert here, that's why I have added the recitals, so everyone can know what I'm forming my opinion about, is it's quite inward oriented. I think there's plenty of opportunity and a lot of need to orient it more outwards. So to use it strategically as a stepping stone towards global carbon pricing. And Justin Becker and Peter Wies have written a very insightful and stimulating short policy brief on that, where they describe it. And their main point is that we need some more flexibility in terms of how we account for different pricing systems. And we also need to be open to other forms of indirect carbon pricing. This is already on the way, we know that. But I think it needs to be made explicit and it needs to be agreed upon as being an important strategic direction. We might also come to the point where we need to reopen the door for offsets. I'll make this short because everyone, I think, should have at least a rough idea what this is about. So this is my final slide, which is probably most worrying. At least it worries me at the moment. I hope it will turn out that the worries were in vain. But what we are already seeing, and I mentioned higher prices coming up and being salient to households, what we are already seeing now in member states are the discussions about the social issues of ambitious climate policies, stringent policies, and not only the social discussion, but also the misuse of social arguments and social facts or non-facts. So this is important, especially in the context of the need of the transition to be just and fair. We have the social climate fund. I think that's really was probably the most important element in making the agreement work. I think it has a lot of good elements. Again, it needs some additional details that needs to be developed. But one can still ask the question: will it be able to deliver? So, and it's not just a technical question, but it's also related to the promise that is made that no one is left behind in the transition. I think it's an extremely big promise, and there's now a tendency to ascribe the solution to it or the delivery, the expectation that all the SDF can deliver it all. So it's really a complicated situation, and if this is not going to work out, I hope it will. So there's the potential for misuse. And I think I already mentioned shortly at the last slide, I think there will be a combined doom and gloom message where the social issue will be combined with a lack of progress. So I'm making things up here. I'm not saying you this will come, but I'm trying to depict a worst case situation that we should prepare for. So making the best out of the Social Climate Fund is extremely important. A lot of that will depend on the member states, on the implementation, but also on the communication. So I think there's not as much a strong role now for the EU as it had been in the past, especially in proposing it. But what could be relevant or what is really, really crucial, there's one design element that is really critical, is that the Social Climate Fund does not scale with the ETS price, because it goes through the multi-financial framework for different reasons. It's not scaled at the moment, which is a reason for concern. And the other thing is that I think EU discussions and the expert discussions in the community should ready itself for the kind of social arguments. And for that, you need to move into monitoring public support and concerns. I don't know, it's probably not in the center of what we discuss in the ETS reforms, it's more a side issue. And there are activities, the Eurobarometer and the EIB is doing such surveys, but this, in a way, they are superficial because they test people's support, and we know everyone supports, but when it's getting really serious, so things might be difficult. And I think moving into this terrain, really understanding what people are concerned about and what people would support is important, not just for the arguments, but also for further developing the ETS to make it fit to the development idea. So that's it.
Thank you very much, Michael. No shortage of food for discussion here. And thanks also for distinguishing between scientific views and your personal political views, which I'm sure some of us will want to take issue with. You will stay with us for the panel. That's great. And it's now my pleasure to welcome an additional panelist, that is Mette Quinn, who is Deputy Director of EU and International Carbon Markets for the Directorate Climate Action at the European Commission. Hello, Mette, you're basically in charge of running the machinery required for governing the EU carbon market. That is incredibly important. Implementing the agreed legislation is crucial and not to be underestimated as a task. Now, the European Commission is already running a public consultation on the EU's 2040 climate target. The deadline is at the end of this week. In addition, last week we've had an opinion published by the European Scientific Advisory Board on Climate Change, advice on the determination of an EU-wide 2040 climate target and a greenhouse gas budget for 2030 to 2050. They recommend a carbon budget which requires emission reductions of a staggering 90 to 95% by 2040 relative to 1990. And obviously, a new climate target, whatever it'll end up being, will have implications for the European emissions trading system as well. Mette, which carbon market aspects do you deem are most relevant to look at in the context of the impact assessment, which the European Commission will have to do for the EU's 2040 climate target?
Yes,
a big question to start off with, but you'll take your own direction with it.
Yes, thank you very much. And thank you for inviting me to this event. So we have just finished the revision, and we are very busy with preparing for the implementation of ETS, but also ETS2 and the Social Climate Fund. And here we are already talking new policies again. It's an exciting and interesting discussion that we have started, and indeed we need to do this. But we also need to hold our horses a little bit. So right now, we are indeed preparing for the 2040 climate target. So we are doing the analysis internally in the Commission. And the aim is that we will come up with an impact assessment and a proposal for the 2040 climate policy target in the first half of 2024. And this is, of course, the basis for revising any other climate policy beyond 2030. So then after we have come forward with a proposal, next year, we will then have a process again with the Council and with the Parliament to agree on the 2040 target. And just like we had for the Fit for 55, when we have a new target in place, then we will adjust all the other policies. So it's a little bit too early to say what we will do on the ETS. But we have already started our work, nevertheless, looking into this. we have launched a study. We are in the study mode right now. We are in the mode of listening to people and experts. So we have launched a study where we have a contractor that will talk with a number of experts and do literature survey and also interview different people. So we are really open at the moment for listening. This is where we are. We are keeping an open mind. We are going to look at many of the issues that Michael was mentioning. Of course, the market stability reserve, the role of removals, the international aspect, all these are being analyzed. But it's premature to really have, for me, from the Commission side, any view on them yet. We are really in the listening mode, and we want to hear what all the experts have to say and list the available options. The decisions on all of this are going to come with the new Commission. It's only going to be decided when we have, after the elections next year, and when we have a new Commission in place, that we will have a view. So we have a very nice time now to debate, to listen, to get ourselves more informed from all the various experts. And I think that's what I can say about this for now.
Thank you very much. Mette, you're throwing me a challenge by saying it's premature to have any views. I'm going to challenge you nevertheless on a few views. Let me pick two things from Michael's presentation. He said he declared it as his own view, but it's an interesting one, that the integration of removals into the ETS is a matter of how, but not if. Would you dare comment on it? The second thing that seems controversial, and Michael also, I think, signposted it as a personal view, was that under CBAM, there might be a possibility of reopening the door for offsets under Article 6. I'm daring. You might tell me you can't respond, but I'm trying.
No, but I can respond by saying that we do have already put into the ETS directive that we have to, by July 2026, we then have to come forward with an impact assessment and a possible proposal on how negative emissions could be that are permanently stored, for example, through direct air capture or BECCS, and how they could be accounted for and how they could be covered by emission trading. So we will come to that concretely in 2026. And this will be a thorough assessment. But before that, we need to have some other policies in place. So we need to have the carbon removal certification framework in place and fully functional before we can do this analysis. This is very important to know how that works. It needs to be adopted, and we need to have all the implementing legislation in place as well, so we know the technical requirements before we can assess to what extent this could be relevant for the ETS. So there are certain steps that we want to have in place, and that we need to make sure that these are really sound policies before we can think about whether this will be relevant for the EU ETS. So that's that element. And on the CBAM, it's also a new instrument, and we are also just starting the implementation of CBAM. So there it's also, it's also a little bit too early to say what we can do. I think our role right now is to make sure that we have a very good implementation. It's important to us that they are explained to the international actors what the CBAM really is. That there are some countries that view CBAMs as a protectionist instrument, and we have to explain that this is not the case, but it's WTO compatible. We have seen all this. Also, many countries say we will then develop our own carbon markets, and I think that's a very good element. So here we would like to help and support jurisdictions that will develop carbon markets in order to reduce their CBAM price when they export to the EU. So these dynamics are where we are right now, and we will do a lot of reporting on the on how the CBAM works in the beginning. And I think we need to let all of this happen before I really have a view on new elements in the CBAM.
Thank you very much, Mette, for your replies. In a way, it is reassuring that the European Commission takes such a careful, considerate approach, is taking its time to hear stakeholders, investigate views for coming about with new proposals. Nevertheless, let us open the discussion and have more views on the way forward, the prospective developments of the ETS in the framework of defining the 2040 goals, looking ahead to the next review of the ETS, what changes will be needed in the next review, and what changes are maybe not needed, what is already okay. I'll be asking the same question to all the panelists. My request to the audience, keep the questions coming. I will pick them up as best as I can. Who shall I ask first? Camille, would you like to make a start again?
Thank you, Sabine. Yes, I'm happy to start with answering your question on what's the best way forward when it comes to the next ETS revision, looking at the 2040 targets. So maybe one point to emphasize is that we should make sure that the next ETS revision really allows us to keep a high carbon price. It took so long to get there, and that's really important. It took so many ETS revisions to have a strong ETS carbon price. So I would say that's the first thing in order to really keep the investment going forward in terms of the industry investing in the right technology in order to decarbonize at the moment, and especially 2030 is around the corner. Even if right now we look at 2039 as being like the end game in terms of the allowances will come to an end, but it doesn't mean that industry will have fully decarbonized by then. So really important to keep the integrity of the ETS system. I think for that, what would be also very important is the interlink between the ETS and the CBAM. So when we look at the revision of the ETS, we really have to have in mind a sooner phase out of the free allocation, like the carbon border adjustment mechanism must become the tool when it comes to protection against carbon leakage for the company that need that, but we need to stop with free allocation, and this has to come by 2030. So this really is one important point. Maybe another important point is also, which was emphasized, I think, by Michael, also paper, is about the revenue, the ETS revenue that will be made. It's really important also in the next ETS revision to clearly define what is a climate action, because that's been shown that so far ETS revenue has been spent in various policies, and also could have been like counterproductive to climate action. Many member states have spent their climate ETS revenue, on non-climate action. So I'm thinking, I have a couple of examples in mind of member states who actually did invest in fossil fuels with their ETS revenue. So that's something that should be stopped, and that should be stopped with the next ETS revision. And for that, we really need a clear definition of what is climate spending. Another thing is actually going back to what Michael said and what you asked Sabine about the carbon removals and how this must be or not integrated into the ETS. I think for us, what's very important is to have a separate target, and we should not have removals traded within against emission reduction. We really need emission reduction through the ETS, and so we see that we really need separate targets when it comes to carbon removals, and this should not be integrated in the ETS. And I will stop here and happy to answer to any other question.
Thank you very much, Camille. And you managed to talk about the use of EU ETS revenues after all, and what will be important there going forward. Ola, would you like to go next to look at the challenges ahead with the next ETS review in the context of defining the 2040 target?
Yes, and I would like to address maybe some other comments also here. I think just to recall what the EU Climate Advisory Board said, what we need for 2040 to stay online with the sort of, for EU to have a fair contribution to the 1.5 target, it means reductions with 95% to 2040. So I think from that perspective, the EU linear reduction factor, as we saw here in the presentation by Michael, going to zero in 2039 or 40, I think we should really stick to that. It's a tough ambition, but that's what we need on the ETS level. And also that the free allocation after 2030 really needs, it should ideally be zero already by 2030, but at least that there's no slacking of or relaxation of the plans there, that it really goes to zero by 2034. So I think those two parts is just keep the ambition as it is. Then I think when it comes to, there will be residual emissions in ETS by 2040. We will not be able to maybe remove all of them from the whole industry, all the sectors covered by the ETS. So to introduce a possibility for really high removals with high integrity, real negative emissions could be an option to keep the system alive and to sort of handle those residual emissions still in there. And knowing the cost of these technologies now and the volumes available, we know that the prices will be really high for these removals in a way. So in a way I support Michael there. I think it's a question of when rather than if going forward. But knowing that the volume there will be very limited, it means that really the industry needs to go near zero, all sectors. Article 6, I think if you compare it to when we had the CDM and JI period previously in the ETS, EU really helped development in other parts of the world, helped develop new technologies, but it didn't really do much for the transition in EU. I think a big difference now, talking about Article 6, is we must be aware now that we now in the hard to abate sectors have the clean technologies available. It's possible to invest to go to near zero in these sectors, which is a big difference maybe to the situation we had then almost 10 years ago when we had the big input of the Kyoto protocol mechanism, CDM and JI, sort of the predecessor of Article 6. So I'm very reluctant to sort of add that aspect again into the ETS. Really, what we need to secure is that we get real mitigation within the ETS system. Then just to comment on some earlier comments here, I think we talked a lot about social acceptance. I think it's absolutely crucial going forward here to have support for the climate agenda, but also that we don't need any reversing any regulation on the Fit for 55 or the ETS or CBAM. We really need a strong support for this. So I think it's a really crucial aspect to have in mind. But I think we also need a competitive industry in EU. We need to be a competitive economy going forward. And I think in that sense, it means that in some parts, they're like the blast furnaces. They are now located in many times where we had coal earlier on. Those coal resources are now depleted, but still we have the blast furnaces there. Those blast furnaces needs to be shut down in many places, but instead they will become new industries, new jobs, hopefully in this exactly same location, but at least in the same countries. And I think that's what we see with the Net Zero Industry Act, for example. All those technologies now that we plan to support and secure a European production capacity will create new industry jobs and secure industry jobs. And I think we need to, if we support the old industry installations that don't make sense too long, we could keep them alive for a while, but in the end, they will die and not be competitive, and we will lose those jobs anyhow. So that's why I also talk a lot about the single market and have state aid on the EU level playing field and really support the industry installations that have a chance to be long-term competitive. And that's what we need. I think the new, and just an example, our plant, we're ordering the electrolyzers from Germany, the steel plant from Germany. These companies, we need to scale their production and hire new persons for going forward. I think that you will see the same when it comes to deployment of renewable energy. Are those techniques produced in Europe? We will have a lot of new jobs as well. So it's not about saving every job in the old industry. It's also about creating new jobs and creating a competitive economy. And a last point there is environmental integrity can actually be, I mean, it's a threat. We see this. I understand it's seen as a threat for many, but it can also be used as a competitive advantage going forward. I think if you look on the integrity of sort of renewable hydrogen in US and US IRA, if that is not sort of handled in a good way, it could be that the more stringent handling or definition of renewable hydrogen in Europe could be really a competitive advantage going forward. So I think we should, in a way, it should be seen as an opportunity here for EU to go forward.
Thank you, Ola. Benjamin, it'll be your turn in a moment, but you'll no doubt bring up new issues. So before you bring up the new issues, let me pick up on some of the things that Ola has said and throw some questions back to the other panelists. I will formulate them all to give you time to speak about them. Michael, Ola just mentioned that blast furnaces need to be shut down, and that could be as a result of policies other than the EU ETS. Now, if you look at the work you have done, which is about the assumptions or the expectations that might affect price development in the ETS, is that actually sufficient, or do we also, apart from price modeling, do we also not need to model the effect of non-pricing policies and how they might interfere with ETS prices? That's my question to you. Then Mette, we had this point about whether the CBAM could be opened up to offsets under Article 6. My understanding is that the CBAM legislation currently actually rules this out because it requires a carbon price paid in the country of where the trading partner is located as an equivalent to the ETS price. So this avenue seems to be forestalled to me, but perhaps you could comment more on that, and please take your liberties in moving on to other issues as you answer that. And my question to Camille, Ola said there could be space for removals with high integrity in the ETS, but that those volumes will be limited. Now we know they're not just removals with high integrity, they're also removals with low integrity, and there are several dangers arising from that. Could you kind of expand on what you said previously about the need for keeping removals out of the ETS? Talk about the dangers around emission deterrence and why we would be safer with two separate targets. I hope that's not too much. It's take it as you can. If you want to deviate slightly from answering, that's also fine. And when you're done, then we move on to Benjamin, and then I'll see about picking up one more audience questions, and then that'll be it. Michael.
So in terms of doing other modeling or modeling more policies or more real world developments, I mean, that's always desirable from the point of view of understanding how things go. At the same time, there are, I mean, like it's the challenge for policymakers now. I could put so many things in our model. I would not know what to choose. So so that's my philosophy, is to always keep things simple and focus on what is relevant for the policy debate. And I think it's in terms of what will happen to industries that cannot keep up with the needs of the green transformation, but also with a broader changing situation, the global situation, and the change of trade flows and all those things. This is not something I would be too concerned about. I would be concerned about how we are spending all the money for innovation subsidies and so on that is now more or less on the table everywhere. So I think that the main challenge with regard to the industry transformation is to get money into funds and other things, but then to spend it wisely. And this, I think, is first of all an issue of the regulatory framework, but also of contract design. So what we would like to see, or what I think is extremely important, is that we, choose the right firms which have a fair chance of survival. So I agree with that on Ola, but then all firms would probably make a claim that, yeah, we have a fair chance, and then the modeling might come in, but I think that would be too hypocritical to actually say we can do that with modeling. I think we should do that through policy design, and an important element in that is really to make sure that we have the right allocation of risks between society and government and firms. So what I'm seeing now, especially the review on the German situation, is that you get basically risk-free support for transform your industry. And I have some sympathy for paying in full, but I also have some concerns that we're spending too much on what would not eventually pay out, and that we undermine the incentives to really deliver the best technologies by paying too much and to transferring away too many risks. So I would actually go do modeling in that direction. How does different allocation of risk and different contract design affect the potential investment behavior for firms? And actually we are doing that.
Thank you, Michael. I see a thumbs up from Ola. But now I turn to Mette again. And as I said, you can also go beyond the question that I asked you and pick up anything else you'd like.
Yes, so thank you. So maybe starting on the CBAM, we are very busy right now preparing all the implementing legislation, and there is a lot. It's not an easy instrument to implement. We need to ensure that we can monitor the effective carbon price that has been paid. That's what the legislation says. So it's clear for CBAM that those countries that have an ETS like the EU, that are completely linked or participating in the EU emission trading, like Norway, Iceland, and Liechtenstein, and the link with Switzerland, there will be no CBAM price paid. And then the next step is those who have ETSs, but where the carbon price is different. This is where we will have to see. Then there will be the difference will have to be paid. So then there will be a reduction in the CBAM value for the executive for the carbon price. But these are the kind of the easier parts of it. And then we have to have a system where we are really able to effectively monitor what the effective carbon price has been paid. So there are small openings for other types of ways where carbon pricing has been paid. But for those, we have to be very, very certain that they are legally binding and that they are properly implementable, and that we are not opening to something that in the end is perhaps not effective carbon price that has been paid. So these details are being put into the legislation now, and yeah, these elements are to indeed to ensure that it's an enforceable system that has a proper carbon price in place. But I would also like to briefly say that I think the elements that that Michael were mentioning are very much in line with the issues that we are looking at now for what we need to look at for the next review of the ETS. It is these questions, but as I said, we are not open yet to really have any answers on them, and they depend also on how we implement the legislation in certain areas, as for example on the removals. We are also very aware that we do have with the ETS as it is now by 39, there will be no, for the existing ETS, there will be no more allowances auctioned. There will be still some allowances left in other parts, but very, very little. So there are issues we need to look at in detail on how we tackle that best. But still, as I said, I'm happiest at this stage to listen to other people's views on this as we are finalizing and as we are doing our own impact assessment on the 2040 target first, and then looking more detailed into what we want to do on the ETS.
Thank you very much, Mette. I turn to Camille for the question on removals, the distinction between high integrity, low integrity removals, the issue of separate targets. It also links with an audience question, which we have from Zero Certified. The question is, would you agree that we also need to integrate DACs into the EU ETS in future, direct air capture, carbon and carbon storage, rather than only point source absorption and storage? A rather technical question. Let's see whether you can cover that as well, Camille. If not, maybe somebody else can.
Yes, thank you, Sabine. I must say that I'm not the carbon removal expert within my team. We do have one expert in the team, and I think she will answer better than me on really the implication when it comes to carbon removals. But just maybe I would try to give some, let's say, idea of response by actually just saying that even the IPCC latest report, assessment report, made it quite clear that both natural sink and technical removals need to complement, but not to substitute emission reduction. And I think that's why we need a separate target, because what we need to achieve with the ETS is really emission reduction. And if you integrate those removals into the ETS target, what you risk is to trade emission reduction against actually carbon removals. And that will be at risk, because then you will have those certificates which are now being discussed, and there's the carbon removal certification framework against clear emission reduction. And those two things are really not the same. So that's why I think we're calling really for separate targets when it comes to carbon removals, and not trade one against another. So I hope this is part of the answer.
Thank you very much, Camille. And yeah, sorry for maybe putting you out of your comfort zone, asking you to comment on a adjacent policy area. I now turn to Benjamin with an invitation to comment broadly and possibly bring up other issues on the next revision game for the ETS in the context of the discussion on the 2040 climate, the determination of the 2040 climate target.
Thank you, Sabine, and thank you, Michael, for the really interesting presentation. We are discussing internally our answer to the 2040 consultation. We have to say that the more we listen to DG Climact, Mette's colleague, the more we like our job. I mean, every 6 months they are asked to reinvent the wheel, and it's never enough, never good enough, never ambitious enough, and they have to include a series of long series of complaints. So we acknowledge that it's a quite challenging job. The first point when we discuss 2040 target is indeed first to acknowledge the scale of the challenge. we already have on a daily basis emails from our membership asking us how the 2030 targets and the different files of the Fit for 55 package will impact their job, their daily life. But when we look at what the 2040 target and related policy instruments might look like, I think it's fair to say that we are entering into uncharted territories. We have never achieved in the history of mankind such deep and rapid changes at a wide, at an economy-wide scale. So the first question we would like to ask is ETS really the kind of instrument which is the best to achieve that kind of results? Is carbon pricing, and more precisely a cap and trade system, the best policy tool to decarbonize energy-intensive industries? Just to mention them. In less than 2 decades, we have strong doubts about that. We have strong doubts because we have never seen something like that being achieved in the past. We see a lot of unanswered questions. How geopolitics will be integrated? What would be the impacts on sectoral trade balance? What if in 10 years, 15 years time, we realize that only, I don't know, I drop a number like that, 20–30% of the industrial domestic production in a sector is able to be fully decarbonized? What does that mean? Do we simply shut down all the other facilities and replace them by imported industrial goods? CBAM might not be the perfect answer to all those questions. So there are a series of questions that we see immediately looming while discussing the 2040 target. That's why we really believe that we need to step back, see where we are in 2030, make a 360 degrees impact assessment, and open the question, is ETS the tool, the policy instrument fit for purpose? And if yes, what kind of ETS would we need? There is no clear answer to that question right now. Two, on what kind of ETS? We have discussed with some members. We have read a series of interesting articles, including in Le Monde recently, which show that, yeah, currently the ETS is a bit of a black box. There are a series of actors, and the majority of actors having positions in the ETS are not entities having compliance obligations under the ETS. So for a series of actors, whether we like it or not, ETS is seen as a bit epitomizing some of the, let's say, the dark side of the casino economy. If we would link the ETS with a series of uncertain schemes or processes offsetting carbon removals and so on and so forth, we fear that we will add another layer of complexity and lack of transparency, and it might feed the public reluctance, the public resistance towards the EU climate policy agenda. You might argue that yes, but we might develop a series of safeguards, notably at international level, to ensure that we will be able to link and compare the different carbon pricing schemes across the globe. I've been involved for some years in my career in UNFCCC discussions. I'm not sure that reaching a kind of global carbon pricing scheme is a realistic prospect in the time frame we have ahead of us to decarbonize the world economy. The recent discussions in Bonn last week with a series of major countries being extremely reluctant to just discuss the mitigation agenda. I mean, all those elements make me extremely skeptical about the possibility to link in a structural way the ETS system with global carbon schemes while keeping the environmental integrity and, I would say, avoiding kind of speculation and unacceptable windfall profits.
I have Benjamin, your skepticism is well understood, is well clear, and history of the ETS is on your side with the point that the ETS alone will not be sufficient to decarbonize industry. Even now with the strengthening of the ETS, that is probably the case. What are you putting forward as more efficient or also important instruments to decarbonize heavy industry, because you are in agreement with that premise that it needs to happen?
Yeah,
what would you like to see?
And
what would you like to see in addition? How would you like to see the ETS strengthened with supplementary, complementary policies going forward?
We have a wide range of instruments that exist in the EU or that could be contemplated. We have the Net Zero Industry Act. We have more broadly the EU Green Deal Industrial Plan. We have the Just Transition Fund and the related policy cycle with a series of plans that have been discussed in the different regions. Not always with the kind of involvement of social partners that we would have liked to see, but we have a wide range of existing instruments that should complement, support the decarbonization, the ETS in decarbonizing energy-intensive industries. And we believe that this industrial policy agenda is maybe more important than just the ETS, because certainty matters for investors, certainly. I understand and acknowledge that, but certainty matters for regions and workers too. And I'm afraid that if we go for the kind of policy framework that Ola just described, we might end up with just a couple of regions around the Baltic Sea where the benefits of the low carbon industry will materialize, whereas other regions that are currently highly relying on those industries will just have to shut down their existing facilities. And to be clear, nobody is defending the status quo. The status quo is not an option. We are defending a transformation agenda in all European regions, trying to ensure that all European regions can contemplate the 2040 and 2050 horizon as a positive prospect. Because if we do not ensure some kind of coherence and consistency between the climate agenda, the social agenda, and the cohesion agenda, we will end up in a situation where the political backlash will make the Green Deal agenda fail. So just transition framework, additional money, additional fund for all the EU funds dealing with the transformation of the industry, including the Just Transition Fund, but not only, are absolutely key to put on the agenda. And by the way, what has been announced yesterday in the context of the MFF review was a bit of a disappointment from that perspective, because we believe that what has been announced is not at all at scale with the challenge ahead of us when it comes to decarbonizing energy-intensive industries in a socially acceptable way.
Thank you very much, Benjamin. That leads me neatly on to a last audience question, which I will pick up, and it is addressed to you, Michael. You mentioned in your presentation the concerns about the social climate fund, and that member states would need to lead on public support and communication, is how the person asking from Citizens Climate Europe here puts it. Could you comment a bit further on that? And then I'll give a final word to all of you with a request to encapsulate what is the most important issue in revising the ETS forward in the next review? Michael, back to you with a question on the limitations of the Social Climate Fund.
Yeah, thanks, Sabine. It's probably more relevant to talk about how to organize social compensation in an effective way. And it was quite interesting to see that Benjamin also, I mean, ultimately, the Damocles sword above all that is social unrest and so on. I mean, we know that already, and I think there's a concern, but there's also a narrative about it. And then it's exactly what I was referring to in my talk, and we need to sort the things out. And I do see a lot of responsibility on the social issues on the member state level, because they get the money from the fund, but they get much more money, or many member states get much more money from the revenues. And there's social policy, there's industry policy that's related to jobs. So it's all a big mix of different policy domains that come together. And so I think how to organize that, and then it breaks down to an issue of solidarity and how member states organize themselves. If they are willing to fully integrate what they are doing, if they are setting up some, let's say, industrial policy, and if they have their social policies, they need to be ready and willing to really make them green. So not a green touch, but it needs substantially deep integration. So it cannot be on top. There needs to be deep integration, and it must be seriously green, not light green. It must be dark green. Otherwise, it's fooling people. And if it's deep green, it also needs to come with communication that is effective, but that is also honest, and makes clear that for everyone willing to be part of the transition, there's support. But for everyone who's refusing, it will mean a bankruptcy or being left behind. So I think this is a big job that member states need to accomplish, and there are a lot of policy options on the table. But it's first of all a question of being honest, of seriously adopting the idea of a green transformation, and then putting it into a political strategy. And this is I think this is my main point I have to make here.
Thank you very much, Michael. And now a last word from each of the other 4 panelists. What is an issue about the ETS that definitely needs to be addressed in its next review? Mette, I know you have to be cautious with your reply, but I'm daring you nevertheless.
Yes, thank you. I will rather sum up a little bit from the discussion, which I think has been a really good one. I agree totally that we need to keep the focus on having a carbon price that's high and that's meaningful. That's going to drive this transformation. And I agree that is an important element for getting the transformation. Also, I agree that the reductions really need to take place in the industries. We cannot rely on removals. We must do our utmost that it's the industries and support the industries to do the transition. The green transition is a possible pathway, as was outlined by one of the participants, and it will create a lot of new jobs in many different regions, and it is possible. So for that, we need to keep the high carbon price, but we also need a lot of support instruments because it's not easy. We have revenues that will continue to be high if the price is high. So we have member state revenues. They can do a lot of social policies. We also have the Social Climate Fund that can do some, but only some. Ultimately, the member states will have to do also a lot themselves. And then we have a lot of different instruments at European level also to help the industries. You were mentioning the Just Transition Fund, the RRF. There are a number of different, there's the Innovation Fund, there are a number of different instruments. Of course, they can't cover it all, but taking together these elements, I think are super important in order to move this to this very deep and serious transition. That is what we need to do in the coming years. So this is, I think, what we will aim for with whatever we are going to do with the ETS, and also the policy is outlined. It's not a black box. We do have the ETS will continue beyond 2030, exactly the way we have set it out, even without any review. So there are long-term perspectives with the ETS, and I would leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mette, and good luck with your work, and thanks for coming onto this panel. Ola, what's your, oops, and Ola has just gone off camera, just as I wanted to ask him for his encapsulation. Ola, are you still there? No, if not, then let's hope he'll come back in a second, and I'll pass the word to last word to Benjamin, please.
No, a quick word, maybe to clarify. Of course, a carbon price and a high carbon price is part of the menu to decarbonize the industry. It's essential to drive investments towards the cleaner technology. The question we have is that having a high carbon price to reduce emission is one thing, reaching zero emission is something else. And I'm still wondering how an ETS could work under zero emission. I'm just asking the question. I don't know. I see a lot of question marks and blind spot. Hence, the need from our perspective to complement the carbon price with a series of instruments that will ensure that we will have an effective EU-wide industrial strategy that will entail the decarbonization of industrial sites all around Europe. And two, we need also to anticipate changes for workers with a just transition framework that will effectively ensure that no regions and no workers will be left behind. Thank you.
Thank you, Benjamin. You make your message nice and clear. Camille, what is the main recommendation from the Climate Action Network, the community of climate NGOs?
Thanks, Sabine. So yeah, on behalf of WWF, I think we actually agree with also what has been recapped. So we really need to keep the strong carbon price, to keep the stability and the predictability for the investment that are needed. We will also agree that we need a set of policy instruments that complement, I emphasize the word complement, the ETS. So we are like seeing this now with the proposal on the Net Zero Industry Act. But this proposal has to be, let's say, framed in a way that we make sure we actually finance the uptake of key clean technologies, but not all technologies, in order to achieve our 2030 target, and also the end goal, which is also carbon neutrality by 2050 at the latest. Maybe because a lot has been said also around this, the need for a strong social climate fund. Maybe here again, what we really need is to have this approach of, if we want to really support citizens in this transition, one way is really to phase out pre-allocation and make sure that those allowances are really used in order to finance the transition. So if you look at the size right now of the Social Climate Fund, because we didn't really talk about the size, but I think it's capped at 86 billion euro for the period 2026 until 2032, if I'm not mistaken, when actually free allowances will be at least 3 or 4 times bigger in terms of billions of euros. So one way to really support the citizens will be to, in the next ETS revision, to really phase out pre-allocation sooner than 2034. So ideally, really by 2030. And I think I will stop here.
Thank you very much. And Camille, I asked you to represent the Climate Action Europe network here on this occasion. I know well that you're from WWF, but I think there is coherence of views here between your organization and the wider network. Ola, you just made it back in time also to have a last word and to encapsulate what you think will be an important issue, or the most important issue to address in the next ETS review.
Okay, I try to reiterate what I said earlier. I think keep the overall ambition when it comes to lowering the cap so that it goes to 0 by 2039. Ideally, have a faster timeline for the phase out of reallocation, but at least keep the current timeline with the full phase out by 2034. use revenues to support the green transition. I think, I mean, just to comment here on Benjamin, I clearly want to see industries and aspiring economy in all EU member states, but we need to see the differences, like the high electricity usage will be in the north and south maybe, or close to the North Sea, but there are other comparative advantages in other member states, for example, capacity of skilled personnel and other aspects like that. So I think we will have, we shouldn't do the same in every member state, but each member state will have its share in the green transition. I think I'll stop there.
Thank you very much. Well, a big thank you to all of you for engaging in this debate. It was lively. Of course, in some instances, we could only scratch the surface, but well, it was interesting. It's up to everybody to stay on the topic and read and discuss more in other contexts. I'll pass over at this point to Sam, who will conclude this webinar.
Thank you very much, Sabine, and thank you very much to all the panelists for the very interesting exchange. I listened attentively. I've been silent for in the meantime, but it was a great exchange and well done. Just a few concluding thoughts from my side, and we've been looking at a very mature policy, climate policy instrument here. The ETS directive, it went into force in 2003. It's been operational since 2005. So depending on how you calculate, it's between 18 and 20 years old already. So it's a grown-up policy instrument, but it's perhaps not completely mature yet. I think if I stretch the analogy, I mean, it's maybe not a responsible adult yet, but it's still behaving like a teenager to some extent. The past 15 years and what we have been looking at based on the modeling from Climact has been a lot about testing, getting things right, learning by doing, and slowly making sure the carbon price signal matters to the sectors and the economic actors which are covered by the policy instrument. I think if we look ahead towards 2030 and beyond, this will be very different. The next 15 years will be a lot more about consequences. And unfortunately, I do need to mention the consequences of the climate crisis and the impacts which will be felt increasingly throughout Europe, and which will also, I mean, in a narrow economic sense, seriously affect the cost-benefit balance of whatever we're trying to do under the EU ETS. I think there's good news at the same time, because the consequences will also be there in terms of getting the investments there in those industries, in those sectors, with getting the transformation off the ground, the clean technologies rolled out. And at least our hope from the side of Carbon Market Watch is that the polluters pays principle and the way carbon is priced throughout the economy in Europe can give a helping hand to that. This is where the revenues come in. This is where I fully support the remarks which are made on making sure this is fair, that this makes sense at social level, and that we can make sure that those investments go in the right direction. I'm left a bit hesitant about the end game notion. I'm still not sure if end game is, it doesn't really make me happy, but I do think it is a happy place to be, and we are in a good position once the cap gets close to zero. It needs to be a plan for success. It needs to be something exciting. I think this is what we have been trying to talk about here. How can we make that happen, and how can we ensure the conditions are right for respecting that carbon budget, which is necessary. The European Scientific Advisory Board put a clear stake in the ground earlier this week. It's very clear what is the challenge which is out there. I just want to remind you at the very end here, the European Commission's consultation on the 2040 target is open until the end of the week. We encourage everybody to make their voice and opinion heard, not to make Mette and her colleagues' life more difficult, but to make sure that this input is there and we can all contribute. From our side, we see a critical role for the EU ETS there to contribute to a net zero target by 2040. That's a responsibility which is clearly out there. And we look forward to continue to engage with everybody on these important aspects and carbon pricing throughout Europe and beyond. Thanks again to everybody for participating. Thanks to the panelists, thanks to my colleagues and also the colleagues at WISE for organizing this. And we look forward to welcome you at the next occasion. Have a very nice day.